Welcome to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast, a podcast from the Berlin-based Think and Do Tank, Adelphi Global, bringing you the latest insights and debates in international climate diplomacy and security. I'm your host, Alexandra Steinkraus, and in this series you will hear from experts and practitioners offering their take on climate foreign policy, climate-related impacts to security, and promoting peace and resilience in a changing climate. For more information, please visit climate-diplomacy.org or follow Climate Diplomacy and Security on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. Welcome back to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. This month we're here with Assem Mayar, an independent researcher specializing in climate change, transboundary water management, and environmental security. He is also one of our newest members of the Climate Security Expert Network. Welcome, Assem.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor for being here and speaking on the topics of climate change, water diplomacy, and the fragile states resilience, which is a core topic for regional and global dialogues. Thank you.
Wonderful. Really happy to have you on this month's episode. So to kick us right off, your work bridges scientific research as well as policy and addresses these complex interconnections between water, energy, and food security in fragile contexts. Can you start us off by giving a brief overview of what these interconnections are?
Thank you very much. Actually, if you look at the real systems, how the natural phenomena occur or how the Earth system evolves, everything has been interconnected, but in the educational purposes, it has been split into different disciplines. For example, if you look at the school, it has been divided into chemistry, biology, and physics, but in the universities has been divided into different disciplines. For example, agriculture, water resource, environment, and things. These are done because to be able to learn them, but in practice, we see that this group of experts come together to find solutions for the real world problems. So that's why they are interconnected, and the pressure on one has a consequences on other disciplines. If I come to the very specific examples, one of the interdisciplinary topics that I was working on during my postdoc research is the WIF-E nexus, water, energy, food, and ecosystem. So this means that these four are very interconnected, particularly in the Central Asia, where the upstream country produce water and hydropower, and the downstream country requires water for agriculture and food security. So if the upstream country use or store water for their energy demand, the downstream would be affected, and the agriculture and the food security. But if it release water, then there would be no energy production. So that's why these sectors have a trade-off and interconnections in the real world, and this depends on the experts to find an optimal solution that get the highest benefit out of these combinations of the different sectors. That's why we can see that the climate change, security, food security, water resources, these are all interconnected, and consequences of one can lead to cascading effects into another one. I would also say one other thing, that the climate and security was also related, because the consequences of the climate change stress water resources and food security, and that's why the people who live in that community, for particularly in the fragile states, step up to gain food through other means, and that's illegal trade, illegal narcotics, cultivation, violence, and other things. We would discuss through these topics during this dialogue today. And this is a conceptual interconnection, but in the practical examples we would have during the discussion.
Yeah, that's really helpful to have a bit of this slightly more theoretical background, something a little bit broader. As you mentioned, we'll definitely get into these practical elements and a kind of real life case studies. And as you already said, your work focuses on Central Asia as well as Afghanistan. So for the scope of this podcast, I think we'll also mainly talk about water, but as you mentioned, there's no way to only talk about water. We're inevitably going to be talking about food, energy, and some of these other topics. And since the USSR's collapse, shared water resources have caused many disputes and tensions in Central Asia, and the management is highly politicized. So what challenges and opportunities do you see for water diplomacy within the region?
Thank you very much. If you look at the Central Asia, it was a very centralized water management system applied in this region during the Soviet Union. The upstream countries were producing water and that was flowing to the downstream countries. The downstream countries had the flat lands for developing and expanding their agriculture production, particularly cotton. So based on the communism principles, it was equally distributed among the states. But following their independence, each country had their own national interest, and that was kind of competition over these shared resources. Though later they have agreed on keeping the existing mechanism for water resource management, but there were some events of competition on the water resources. For example, the dam construction in the upstream countries, for example, in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, were multiple times criticized by the downstream countries, particularly Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, as well as Kazakhstan. And the former president of Uzbekistan even treated the upstream countries that they will go into war if they invest on water. But recently have been further developments. One another challenge is, for example, the expansion of the agriculture in Afghanistan, the Kush-Tepa Canal, that they will divert water from the Darya River, which is estimated about 15%. And this will affect the downstream Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, which has been already stressed to water. So these are the challenges, new challenges adding to the complexity of the region, but there are also some opportunities developing in order to overcome these challenges. For example, we see now the open policies of Uzbekistan that is helping the region to be more stable. And for example, it offered free trade and free visa transit to the Tajikistan people in order to not pressure the downstream country of Uzbekistan with the water stored in the Raghun Dam. Not only that, there is also another agreement on the dam construction on the Zarafshan River. So that means that the upstream country will produce energy only when there is water requirement for the downstream, for example, in summer. So such examples or such opportunities brings the region closer. Furthermore, there are also development with Afghanistan, for example, that Uzbekistan is working closely with the de facto authorities of Afghanistan. And there are also another development like the Tapi gas pipeline that's planned to deliver gas from Turkmenistan to India. Though it has been not now being constructed to be extended to India, but at least now it's the progress to the Afghanistan. So such initiatives, such interconnections, like, for example, electricity trade from the Central Asia to Afghanistan, this can make the region more interconnected and dependent on each other. So in that case, the countries will not prioritize strictly or strict to their national interest, and also they will keep in mind the downstream requirement, and that's the sign to go forward for more harmonized future for water resources. Though the climate change stress the region because temperature is increasing more than the global warming average in this region, and that's affecting the water resources, particularly the glaciers melt and seasonal variability in the river flow. But there are some initiatives in progress in the region to more connect the region and for create opportunity for cooperation.
Thanks very much. And speaking of Afghanistan, especially in this group of countries, do dynamics differ in Afghanistan, and what challenges do these kinds of political situations pose? And again, speaking of these opportunities of cooperation, what kind of opportunities are there for Afghanistan to be better integrated into these regional initiatives and even further strengthening cooperation beyond these immediate countries?
Thank you very much. As we see the fragile countries, the politics and the systems change unexpectedly, I would say, in the short term, and that's challenging the opportunity for working or cooperation. And that's why it's very complex to work in such region. What has been changed in Afghanistan is the Taliban's takeover during the August 2021 and the sanctions that are now expanded to the entire country, as well as the non-recognition of the Taliban has caused the money problems to the country, because due to that barrier, the country is unable to interact normally with its neighbors and as well as in the broader world. However, due to the geographical, regional cooperation and geographical location of the Central Asian countries, they interact with the de facto authorities based on their own requirements in order to not only tackle the climate change, but also to tackle the security issues, because the Central Asian states fear that insurgency or the extremism may infiltrate into their countries. So that's why they interact with the de facto authority in Afghanistan to restrict that one from their geographies. So in the cost of that compromise, they have to also compromise on other concerns, for particularly the water. So these dynamics, politics, economy, and the humanitarian crisis changing in the country, and the opportunities or the interaction that the Central Asian countries are having with the de facto authority of Afghanistan. So if you look at the examples, Uzbekistan is the country that was first started their interaction with Afghanistan. But recently, we also seen some kind of reports of interaction of the Tajikistan, who is a very rival state to the Taliban. But we see they also interact based on the realities of the ground and also their own requirement. For example, the Afghanistan did not object on the investment of the World Bank on their own name. So there's also showing an incident of the corporation. And there were also exchange of representatives going to each other countries to communicate. So this and also the electricity trade and other trades made the opportunity for Afghanistan to interact with these countries and overcome the challenges, or at least overlook the water and climate change crisis that the region is facing. They prioritize the economic benefits over the challenges of water and climate.
Speaking of different challenges, bringing us to maybe another topic of climate finance and economics, something that I know you have a lot of expertise on and have recently written about as well. So I want to make sure we bring this into the conversation. So Afghanistan is one of the countries least equipped to absorb the shocks of climate change. And as you pointed out in one of your most recent policy briefs that we will also link in the description for anyone listening that's interested in going a little bit more in depth, these extreme weather events create an average annual loss of between 550 million US dollars and 3.1 billion. So what effects does this economic collapse have within the country?
Yeah, thank you. It's a broad question. I would come from different angles to this. Before the policy brief, I also published a report that discussed details of this economic consequences of the climate change.
We can link that as well, so that way anyone interested in a full report can also dive much deeper.
Yeah, that would be good. If you look at the Afghanistan case, even the Western countries, the hot topic is about the mitigation of the climate change or the restriction of the carbon emission to the atmosphere. But in Afghanistan and that region, the hot topic is the adaptation to climate change, because that region produces very less greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and are most affected from the consequences of the climate change. The aim of that report was in order to understand how much the region or the Afghanistan suffer from the consequences of the climate change and how much it received the aid for the adaptation. So particularly if you look at the framework of the climate finance, it has been designed in a way that the countries are stable and are able to receive the funding through normal framework. So that's the kind of centralized, means the aid should go to the government and the government should be able to expend it on its infrastructure to tackle the consequences of the climate change. While we have seen the fragile and weak states, not only Afghanistan, but also some countries in Africa, are unable to receive the climate finance during the past years, since 2015 and 16. Afghanistan case is further unique. For example, following the collapse of the Republic regime, all development aid, including for adaptation of the climate change, were suspended. So within the past 3 years, Afghanistan received very less through bilateral funding, and that's also not given to the government or the de facto administration. That has been spent through the international organization, for example, NGOs, national NGOs, and bilateral funding. That's why I look into the reality and how to intervene in such a situation. that the world is not giving funding to the de facto authority. So that's why I propose a mechanism of decentralized finance approach. And this means that the country and the people of Afghanistan who suffer from the consequences of the climate change receive a kind of relief aid in order to be invested on the small scale measures that reduce the consequences of the climate change. And that is feasible only through interaction with the NGOs or decentralized approach, means to interact with the organization that is not directly linked with the de facto administration, but they are working independent. For example, the UN agencies, World Bank, NGOs, national NGOs. For this organization needs to receive an agreement only from the focal point in Afghanistan, like the NEPA, it's the National Environmental Protection Agency. So this administration already expressed their willingness to such an agreement, to such a mechanism. So that's why this mechanism make it feasible to reach or access to the country. And this 1.8 degree global warming, which has increased into this level, has reduced the snow precipitation in the country. So the snow was acting as a natural reservoir in the mountain, and that was melting in the summer to irrigate agriculture. Now it melts earlier than that's required for agriculture. And so that's why every summer, though it's a wet year, a normal year, or a dry year, Afghanistan has a crisis of water. Particularly, you may have heard recently that the capital of Afghanistan is facing water crisis, and the groundwater, which is the usual source for drinking water of the people, will dry in 2030. It's totally due to the over-extraction, as well as due to the not adaptation to the climate change, as well as to the early snow melt, and also less precipitation due to continued droughts. So that's why the risk that is related to the climate are, first, more frequent and severe flood and flash flood. The second one is drought. The third one is landslide and avalanche. That is the last one. There are also risks, like, for example, heat wave and cold wave, as well as forest fire, land degradation. You see, when the temperature warm in a room, it affects everything that exists in that room. So that's why the global warming also affects everything there, but we cannot estimate the effect of global warming on everything. But fortunately, we have some estimation from the World Bank, another organization that estimates the losses due to this risk. So I relied based on that and come up with the estimation that you already mentioned. So drought is covering a broad region, and that's why the economic consequences of a drought year is high. And we have also split it. For example, if you see, the region was previously also facing drought and flood in the region. So we have come up with this amount of the losses. So coming to your final question, like how this changed the economic losses in the country. So if you look at, for example, the very recent case of the collapse of Afghanistan in 2021, it was not political, it was also economical. It had the factor of climate change in that one. So we see, when we discuss the entire economy of the country, the role of climate change consequences is about 18% in the GDP of the country. And that's a very huge amount that unevenly affect the population of the country. So if it's equally distributed on the population, it would be tackled, it would be easy, but no, it unevenly affects different regions. So that's why it further strengthened the humanitarian crisis in the country, and it led to a vicious circle of the climate, security, and humanitarian crisis. And if one not address the consequences of the climate change with a proactive strategy to reduce the consequences and harm, the humanitarian crisis will continue, and that would be then the moral responsibility of the world to address at least the humanitarian crisis. So that's why my proposal is to invest on the climate proactively in order to have less humanitarian consequences.
And of course, we're also currently experiencing a period where humanitarian funds are also being drastically slashed, which of course further increasing the viciousness of the cycle when there are even fewer resources to help mitigate the impacts.
Yeah. Actually, that's also a very important point. If we look, aid has been reduced largely from the donor countries as well as with the USAID shutdown. But I think the world should prioritize the fragile state.
I think you make a very strong point that, especially in situations where there's decreasing resources, not as many as previously, these existing funds still really need to go where it's needed the most. And speaking of that, you already mentioned some of the ways that the existing climate finance architecture is falling short. So both within not actually going to different governing authorities that can implement things, but also a really large focus on mitigation, where in many of the most fragile contexts, adaptation is needed the most. Are there any other key points where you see the current climate finance architecture falling short of the needs of fragile states?
Definitely. If you look at the financial flow, the fragile states receive the minimum of this amount. And not only within every year, but to the past decade, I would say from 2015 to 2025. So there are some other mechanisms, like, for example, one of them is the South-South solution that could be supported and strengthened. So that means that the Southern contributor to the climate funds can channel their contributing amount to the fragile states directly without the existing mechanism, because the existing mechanism has its own barriers, like, for example, the UN sanctions, the delay of the funding and other barriers. So that's why they can make another brief mechanism through South to support the South-South solution. We are now seeing the emerging economies from the global South, for example, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, China. These countries can establish another South-South supporting mechanism for addressing climate adaptations. So that's another one, not only an alternative to the already available mechanisms.
Great, thank you very much. And so you've mentioned South-South mechanisms and decentralized climate finance as a potential solution to help build this bridge. What steps can go towards making this work as a viable solution? And do you have any examples of this working in local contexts that can be scaled up or used as an example of success?
For the specific measure, I would say investing on the small-scale project is more applicable, because the large infrastructure also require the legal agreements between the states, like the downstream and upstream countries should reach an agreement to invest a dam. That's also less feasible in the countries, though there are very good mechanisms on examples in the Central Asia that the other countries can learn from them. For example, to produce energy in the summer and then release water for the agriculture, and the downstream countries produce or give energy to the upstream country during the winter. So such kind of cooperating alternatives can be used for reaching that agreement. As we don't have time before waiting to that one, it's wise and logical to invest on the small scale measures. One of the small scale measures is to invest on the rainwater harvesting, urban water network, in order to reduce the crisis that is now very in the peak of in the cities, in the urban region, and also to develop artificial glaciers. It might be interesting to you. There is examples in the India and also in Pakistan being implemented to develop artificial glacier in the winter, and that is storing water on the ground. You see, it not only store water on the ground, it also recharge the groundwater, and later that's melted and used for agriculture. In addition to that one, you see the people also require a cooling mechanism to tackle the heat waves, particularly the infant and the elderly population, which is at risk of death extremes. So investment on a decentralized or distributed solar network would also facilitate the cooling technology for opportunity for cooling to reduce their heat that they'll receive throughout the year. This is not only for the adaptation of the climate change, it also produces opportunity to channel the information to the rural communities of these countries, particularly in Afghanistan. And that is educating that population, and that will end up into the social change. The adaptation funding in the country would also create the opportunity for work for the population, and that's keeping the younger generation out of the conflict. And if they have a job, they will not join the militant or the extremist groups. In addition to that one, we can also invest on the drought-tolerant agriculture. The orange or the banana was cultivating in the hot climate, for example, in Pakistan and India, but nowadays it is also possible to be cultivated in Afghanistan in the southern part. Or we can also introduce further crops that is drought tolerant and able to produce a kind of harvest for the people with less water. We can also improve the water irrigation efficiency. You see, there are a lot of examples, for example, in Central Asia particularly, which is my region of study. But due to the political barrier or the sanctions, these measures are not being implemented in Afghanistan. So you see, we have different examples across the world. But it needs a political will, reliable mechanism, which is feasible through the decentralized approach.
So before wrapping up, I also want to talk shortly about some neighboring countries to Afghanistan that have been making headlines recently. So on the 23rd of April, India suspended the Indus Water Treaty, which has been a 65-year-old agreement that has been a rare symbol of cooperation between India and Pakistan. And for those listeners not as familiar with the treaty, over the last 65 years has allowed India to use the water of the western rivers for some irrigation use, as well as some non-consumptive uses such as power generation, navigation, floating of property, fish culture, and things like that. And this is already having impacts on Pakistan's economy and water resources. Do you have any insights on what this means for the even larger region going forward?
Yeah, thank you very much. If you look at the whole region, there are 3 treaties existing in the Central Asia. One is the Almaty Treaty that is dividing water among the Central Asian states that overlook Afghanistan, which is now an active member of this potential member. I would say they would look to revise that treaty and include Afghanistan because Afghanistan is contributing water to the Aral Sea and the Aral River Basin. And there is another treaty between Afghanistan and Iran. Recently, there is no tension because of the involvement of Iran in the western part. So we have no sign of tension. Usually this time of the year, there is always blaming game and water stress time among these two countries. But there was a very successful example of the Transboundary Water Corporation among the India and Pakistan, which in the recent year ended up into the very unstable situation. And I really concerned about the future of this treaty. So going through the past, like 2019, I would say there has been security incidents between Pakistan and India. Usually when the countries sign a treaty, one of their goals is to cooperate each other and facilitate further economic and good neighborhood opportunities. But in the recent years, there were security incidents within the Pakistan and India region, and that's why India gradually ended up into the suspension of the treaty. So if you look at the previous years, India has given 2 notice for the revision of this treaty for the climate change. But there is also other part as well. For example, India has revoked the Azad Kashmir that's controlled by India and Pakistan. It revoked the autonomy status of that region. So you see, during the treaty, the India willing was that, okay, this region is contested among these 2 countries. So both countries were agreed that, okay, let's have this treaty. And out of the politicization, we would reach the treaty. But now India has already annexed that region within their country. So the status of that region in the treaty is de facto. So that is now being changed to the de jure. That will change. So that's one of the willingness of India that not only security concerns should be addressed and not only the climate change consequences should be addressed. The third goal is to address this option, this area as well. So they will ask within the discussion, if that happen, Pakistan to officially recognize that as a part of India. And not the second one would be the security concerns to be addressed. So this suspension will allow India to invest on their water reservoirs and divert water. And that will reduce the corporation that, for example, that was exchanging the data within the days. So such thing will affect the economy of the Pakistan, like the agricultural sector, and it will have a long-term consequences for the country. And that's the only solution is, you see, if we look at the upstream countries across the world, they have an upper hand and the supremacy to oblige the downstream countries to listen to them. We have some examples of that over the Rhine River, over the water quality, as well as in the US-Mexico treaty over the water quality, that, for example, the US is not addressing the water quality when the budget is less in that year. So it's the downstream country who suffer and rise up to address this problem by themselves. So that India has learned from these examples, and now they are trying to use that as a catalyst for security improvement of that region, as well as to receive more share from the water that's being influenced by the consequences of the climate change. And my prediction would be that Pakistan, after a few years, they will sit to negotiation with India, and finally they will revise this treaty.
Okay, let's see if that outlook comes true. And then, are there any lessons from Central Asia that are applicable to this context that you can share?
Yeah, exactly. There are multiple examples. So the Central Asian state also had rivalry over the water resources, particularly Uzbekistan with the upstream countries. But in the recent years, the Uzbekistan come up with a solution to offer trade opportunities, visa-free entrance of the Tajikistan population in Uzbekistan territory, as well as further joint investment on the hydropower. So these examples could be also used in the Pakistan-India context, and they can come up to settle to develop a mechanism in order to reduce security threats, as well as to produce or use the water in order to not affect Pakistan considerably. And this is feasible, and I think that would be the ultimate goal that the region will reach into that one, or will look into that one. And I would say it's actually an optimal time for Europe as well as Germany to intervene in such a region and find or recommend the ideal solution for this region. And I think organizations such as Adelphi and other that I have seen in with a good capacity of the diplomacy and cooperation can work within these countries or within the actors in that region and finally propose a reliable solution to this problem.
Hopefully we see some of these things like shared resources, things like water management, hopefully we'll also be able to use as a tool for greater cooperation and more future joint cooperation as we move forward. So thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for a very wide-ranging conversation. In light of the current climate that we've touched on at various points, both in terms of climate change, but also increasing aid withdrawal and donor hesitancy, what kind of avenues do you see for climate peace and security programming and policy to be successful in the coming few years in this current geopolitical situation? So a very broad question to end us with, but also please feel free to be broad with your answers as well.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, the region is suffering from the climate change, and I think the first would be to provide more funding or increase the level of funding to this region and invest on the urgent measures that is particularly the disaster risk reduction part, because that is the part that is vanishing the existing resources. And my proposal is always to first reduce the losses and then invest on the opportunities that can contribute or increase the production in the region. Furthermore, I think one of the great measures would be to address the riverbank erosion problem of the Amur River, which is a giant problem among the Central Asian countries as well as Afghanistan. This not only destroy agricultural land as well as the residential compounds in Afghanistan, but also it produced sediments considerable to the downstream infrastructure. For example, it filled the reservoirs of the Central Asia. So investing on this river would get the opportunity to understand the region more and gradually contribute into the climate diplomacy of that region. Furthermore, the capacity building is one of the solutions that is required to raise the capacity of the member states. But in Afghanistan case, I would recommend to select participants from the university students who are not affiliated with the groups that is being sanctioned. I mean, if we do a kind of capacity building and stakeholders, so that's the next generation coming up to manage the water resource in the future, so we can train them. That's also another option. And furthermore, to invest on the research in a comprehensive way, and I mean in basin-wide. So if the EU is investing in Central Asia, but overlooking the Afghanistan part, which is contributing about 18% of water to the RLC, that's a kind of not sustainable solution, because the upstream dynamics in Afghanistan would influence the investment in the Central Asia. So that's why I propose to include Afghanistan in the research in order to better understand how is the things developing there, as well as in the capacity building and diplomacy. And then we can gradually understand and later design the measure to be implemented in the right time and the right place. Furthermore, I think it's good to use the diplomacy for the transboundary water tensions among the countries. And I think that would be a very suitable tool to address the security concern and reduce the consequences of the tension and bring the peace to the region.
Thanks very much for joining us, Assem. It's been wonderful having you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. You're welcome.
So this was the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. We'll be back with another episode in a few weeks. You can follow us for the latest updates on X, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky at Climate Diplo or Climate Diplomacy and Security. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, goodbye.